Welcome to Psychology Today. I'm your host, Wayne Hathaway. Thank you for watching. Our show is about bicycling in general and bicycle safety specifically. I hope Psychology Today helps inspire you to ride a bike and helps you to be more mindful of safety. We try to celebrate those in our community that incorporate bicycling into career choices or entrepreneurial endeavors, strive to encourage others to ride, or support cycling and bike safety. Our producer, Northwest Bicycle Safety Council, is an organization that promotes safety and harmony between cyclists and works to strengthen our community and your families through cycling-related programs and events. We have been distributing helmets at the Tualatin Hills Parks and Recreation Party in the park, Scooping with the Sheriff, Bike Beaverton, and Burgers with Bob in Junction City. We firmly believe that helmets are a critical part of bicycle safety. A quick thank you to our capable crew behind the scenes, volunteers who make our show possible. And riding is fun. Rules are not as fun, but safety allows us to keep riding without interruption, so we like to give some good, solid consideration of bicycle law here in our area and what to do if we do happen to get involved in a crash. Let's meet a couple of our attorneys who deal with the fallout of bicycle crashes and hear their perspective on some new law, new infrastructure, and e-bikes. So welcome, Cynthia and Chris.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So let's talk. We've had Ray Thomas on from your firm before in the past, and so now you're new here to the show. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to the Northwest, career and family. We'll start with you, Cynthia.
Okay. I grew up in Eastern Washington and went to law school in San Francisco, and that kept me in the Bay Area for about 17 years. And in about 2000, my family and I moved to Portland, and I looked for a firm to join, and fortunately found Ray Thomas and his firm, which was then Swanson, Thomas & Coon. And I've been working with the firm ever since 2004. I had done a lot of personal injury work in the past in California, and it was great that STC had a really strong emphasis on bike, pedestrian, and vulnerable user law. And so I got to learn that area of law in addition to the other personal injury work that I'd done, and I've been with the firm ever since. It's just been a great fit.
And how do you like the Northwest?
I love it. I love it, yeah. I love being outside, and I love being able to bike to work in Portland. It was something that is pretty popular in San Francisco now, but certainly wasn't very popular or easy to do when I was down in the Bay Area. So I love being able to bike to work.
Nice.
Yeah.
How about you, Chris?
So I grew up in Northeast Portland. My dad is Ray, who's been on the show before, and I grew up around a cycling culture with him as a parent. When I got to be college age, I went away for school. I went to school in Walla Walla, Washington, and New York City, and realized after moving away that Portland was really a special place to be from and to live. And so I came back here for law school at Lewis and Clark. Really enjoy living in Portland. My wife and I are both from here. Now we've got 3 little boys at home, so we're busy with that.
Yeah, that'll keep you busy.
Yeah, so.
Okay. How about rides? Cynthia, where do you like to ride these days? And what kind of cycling do you like, too?
Yeah. I do like longer rides, but my life has just evolved to a point where I mostly ride to commute to and from Northeast Portland. I love commuting by bike. It's such a great way to start the day, get out in the world, be out in the community, and just a great way to ride home, make that transition from work to being at home. It's the perfect length ride, and I really enjoy it every day. Yeah.
Is it easy for you to go from being cycling straight into the office, and do they have the kind of facilities that help with that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We do have great bike facilities. We have a bike room where you can leave your bikes. You don't have to put it on the street out in the weather, or, if you're concerned about your bike, you know that it'll be safe. And we have showers, and we have places for clothes. So whenever we go out and talk in our bike clinics at workplaces, I always like to encourage folks to do that, because it really is that extra thing that can encourage employees of an organization to bike to work, is that those infrastructure pieces that make it easy to get in and out of your bike clothes and take a shower if you need to.
That's great.
Yeah.
And how about you, Chris? Where do you like to ride?
So a lot of my time lately, when I have free time, is spent with the kids. So I've got a cargo bike, and I end up spending a lot of time riding them around town. I commute by bike. I like to do a little bit of racing. So I'm a Cat 3 road racer, and I really like doing the Mount Tabor series and criteriums and stuff. But it's hard to find time to train. So usually I try to fit it in over the lunch hour, doing the lawyer ride from downtown Portland twice a week. And when I can get out on the weekend, I like to go out to Kelly Point for a nice flat spin after doing more hills during the week.
Yeah.
So.
What about that cargo bike? Do you get the kids on it in the back? Or?
Yeah, so it's got a big box in the front. It's got room for 3 kids. It's got an electric motor and a rain cover, so the kids can stay nice and warm and dry. And most mornings I'll drop off my 3-year-old at preschool and then ride it into work. So it's a good cruiser.
That's great. And the kids enjoy it?
They do, yeah. They've got all kinds of toys in there, and put on their favorite music if they ask for it and stuff like that. It's pretty fun.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you do race too?
I kind of try to maintain a minimal level of fitness to be able to go out and race for about a half an hour. I can't do the long road races anymore, but go up to Mount Tabor and it's fun.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So let's dive in a little bit. So, and I'm going to use some of my cues here to help us go along with the dialogue. So right here now, what are some of your concerns about bicycle safety? Do you have any in general? And Cynthia, do you want to?
Sure. Well, I was thinking about this, and I think that I think it's a little philosophical, but I think that because of the way our culture has changed, and we spend a lot of our days in tech and in screens and those kinds of things, that I think if we're not careful, when we get in our cars, a lot of drivers are still kind of in that mode, and they might even have their phone on because they need the directions or they need the navigation. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect right now between the reality of the physical world and the screen. And so I think that maybe that's contributing to drivers not necessarily driving distracted, but kind of driving on another plane where they're not really engaging in the physical world around them and are not as aware that there might be a pedestrian crossing in the crosswalk in front of them, or there might be a cyclist in the bike lane to the right of them. And so I think that that's a concern for the vulnerable users that are out interacting with the cars. And I guess the other thing I'd mention is I think that there are a lot more middle big cars, not necessarily semis and trucks, which I have always been really worried about, and we've had some terrible fatality cases that we've worked on with those. But the SUV and even the smaller SUV with the larger A-pillars, I think that contributes to drivers not necessarily being aware that there are people outside of cars that are sharing the roadway with them.
I've never even thought about it that way, with the part that you talk about with the technology and people not being conscious of what's going on. But even I can point to times being in the car and getting from point A to point B and maybe not being as aware as I used to be.
Yeah.
Did you ever see, is there like any distinct point in time when you see an increase of vulnerable, what do you call them?
Vulnerable road users, yeah.
Vulnerable road users,
Yeah.
where there's an increase of that sort of injury? Like,
yeah, I feel like it's been in the last few years, and there's a statistic out this year that unfortunately there have been, and I don't have the number in front of me, but it's a significant, way too many pedestrian bicycle fatalities this year. And, you know, again, some people relate that or correlate that with so many SUVs and those kinds of things. But it's unfortunately, even though Vision Zero is a big initiative in Portland, you know, there are still people that are being killed as either cyclists, moped riders, or pedestrians, you know, oftentimes in crosswalks and other places where they're definitely meant to be.
Anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I see as a commuter in Portland, obviously we all have witnessed Portland growing over the last decade or so, and there's a lot of folks just trying to get around, and there's some really great bike infrastructure in town, but it seems to me like some of it ends up kind of putting bicyclists and drivers in points of conflict, where folks are just on these crowded streets where there's a bike lane, and people don't realize, for example, that you're required to yield the right-of-way before turning across a bike lane. So to me, it kind of comes down to a combination of the infrastructure as well as the education about how to use the infrastructure. Those seem like pretty critical issues right now that have an impact on bike safety.
Would you say practicing law or bike law has changed your viewpoint of being out there as a cyclist?
Yeah, I think as cyclists, we all learn to be pretty darn defensive because we are so vulnerable out on the roadway. But certainly, working with bike collision victims regularly gives us a heightened sense of the kind of devastation that can happen in collisions. And you don't want to be so worried about something happening that you don't ride, because it's important to get out and ride, and there's risk everywhere. But certainly when I ride around Portland, there's a lot of intersections where I know something has happened, and it's hard not to sort of visualize what happened to one of our poor clients at some point.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it just makes me ride hyper defensively.
How about you, Cynthia?
I think what practicing bicycle law has made me aware of is risks associated with riding that I didn't necessarily understand as well as I would have. One example of that would be, visibility. We talk about, at dusk and lights from the side and those kind of things. But one of the things that's come up in a number of cases that is when the light levels really change, like dappled sunlight on a country road or something like that, just learning that those are situations where I've heard drivers say, in their depositions or whatever, I never saw that cyclist before I hit them from behind, and it almost seems impossible. But I think, dappled light, for example, is a risk of road riding that I didn't appreciate before. So, it kind of, you can take that information and really put it to good use, letting other people know about those risks, and of course, like Chris was saying, riding really defensively, but just being really aware of those risks and doing everything you can to to mitigate them, and then educating as many people as you can about those so that they don't fall prey to them and get injured where they might not have even known that that was a possibility.
And you called it dappled light?
Yeah, dappled light. So, for example, if you're riding along and then you're in the shade and trees and then you come out into a sunny place, those kinds of times something about the lighting, maybe even depending on the age of the driver, can make it difficult for someone to see a cyclist, even who might be wearing, lighter colored, more visible clothing. It can still be tough for them somehow. Yeah.
Huh. So let's talk a little bit about the Oregon law. And the first one that we're going to come across, it came up in the Senate as Bill 998, and it's called the Idaho Stop. So why don't you share a little bit about the legalese portion of that, and then maybe translate that a little bit for us.
Sure.
In layman's term.
Yeah, so the Idaho Stop is so named because the progressive state of Idaho has had it in effect for some time now, and another way to refer to it is as stop as yield, because what it does is it allows bicyclists to treat stop signs as yield signs, effectively, and it was after many attempts at being passed in Oregon over the last decade or so. It was finally passed this year, and it goes into effect on January 1st. And what it says is that if a bicyclist is approaching a stop sign or a flashing red light, the bicyclist is permitted to reduce their speed to a slow speed, and if there's no one lawfully within the intersection or so closely as to constitute an immediate hazard, then the bicyclist may roll through the stop sign or past the flashing red light.
Okay.
So it's something that, as a cyclist, when you're out on the road and you're trying to conserve your momentum, it's a nice benefit for the law to provide, to allow you to roll through when it's safe to do so.
And you said that goes into effect in January
Correct.
of 2020.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you see as some of the pros and cons of this law?
Right. So I know that when it was being discussed, there was some concern that it would be construed as a license for cyclists to roll through stop signs or make it sound like it was more permissible or something. But if you read the statutory language, it's pretty darn clear that if there's someone who's lawfully within the intersection or approaching, the bicyclist still has to come to a stop as they do under the previous law. And so it really shouldn't, when adhered to properly, lead to any additional risk for any road users. And in our line of work, as people who represent folks who are injured in collisions, it doesn't really change what we do very much, because if before the law was passed, somebody rolled through a stop sign and got in a collision, it was probably going to be a liability issue for them then.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing applies now, because they're still required to yield to folks within the intersection.
Was there a lot of pushback when this law was presented? It sounds like it took some time.
Right. Yeah. My understanding is that it passed the Senate 31 to 28, so pretty narrowly.
Okay.
And there was a fair amount of concern about it being misconstrued, misused. But I think, it had strong support in the House and clearly went into law with the governor's support. So.
Okay. We're before this got put in place, can you point to a time when there was a change maybe of this significance in bike law, and describe a little bit about that change, or can you think of one? I'm throwing that at you.
Sure, yeah. There have been a lot of helpful developments for bike riders over the years in Oregon. We've got a careless driving statute that includes an enhanced penalty when the careless driving results in an injury to a vulnerable user. And that's a unique and helpful protection for people not only on bikes but also walking and also on electric scooters and that kind of thing. We've got a safe passing law in Oregon that requires that when you're passing a bicyclist on a rural high-speed road, that you give them enough room to fall over. That's a big protection. We've got a pretty, it's not necessarily exclusive to bikes, but Oregon has very strong crosswalk protections where every corner is a crosswalk, regardless of whether there's paint on the pavement or whether there's a signal or not. So you can assert your right to the right-of-way in a crosswalk just by putting your foot out in the roadway or putting your bike wheel out in the roadway.
Okay.
And that's a really helpful and strong protection that we've got as vulnerable users.
How do you, when a new change like this comes about, how does the public become more aware? I can just, like, even as a driver myself, have no idea that this law is in place, and so develop some frustration and maybe even animosity
Right.
to riders. So how does it get socialized?
Yeah.
I suspect that there has already been some press in Bike Portland on this Idaho stop. And I suspect that when it comes around to December, that there'll be some lead stories on it, letting people know what's going to happen in the new year. And there is another law as well that's going to come into effect then. So I suspect the bike press will at least start getting it out there, and hopefully other press will pick it up as well.
Yeah, I would think even in this case, for this particular law, even as a rider, an avid rider, I would want as many people to know and understand it, you know, so that there wasn't misunderstandings on the road,
Right.
which can happen. So, let's see. And you talked a little bit about misunderstandings of this. Do you think there's anything else we haven't touched on where, you know, that cyclists should know more about this law to say it's not just a free ticket?
Yeah, I think, you know, referring to it as stop as yield is a nice kind of shorthand way to express that intent, that it's not a free ride through the stop sign, it's treating it as a yield sign. So I think people are familiar with the concept of yielding the right-of-way. You know, a lot of folks treated stop signs that way before when riding in certain places, just by the natural inclination of wanting to conserve momentum. And so, yeah, I think just being real clear that there's still an obligation to slow and stop when there are other folks who are in the intersection or approaching is important.
Great. It's good to learn about that. How about there's also, I'm just looking here, there's a change, ORS 801.155, to clarify the definition of a bike lane. Can you tell us what's changed with that?
Right. So, so this came about because on November 20th of 2017, a 31-year-old was killed when he was struck in an intersection by a right-turning FedEx truck in Bend. And there was a bike lane alongside that vehicular lane, and the judge in Bend refused to cite the driver for failing to yield to a rider on a bicycle lane, on the idea that because there wasn't a bike lane painted in the middle of the intersection, as it was, you know, designated along the side of the road, just because there wasn't paint on the road extending that line through the intersection, that the bike lane didn't exist there. Even though if you read the statute that defines bike lanes logically, and putting the statutes together, the bike lane has always continued through the intersection. The judge just was not willing to buy that. He thought that that would be misleading to drivers, that there wasn't paint on the roadway. They wouldn't know that there was a bike lane there. So it became clear that a legislative fix was needed to change the definition of a bicycle lane. And the language that was added to it, I can go ahead and read, it's really short. It's just, a bicycle lane exists in an intersection if the bicycle lane is marked on opposite sides of the intersection in the same direction of travel, making it absolutely crystal clear that when there's a bike lane on the roadway on either side of an intersection, it continues through the intersection. So that was just important so that this kind of failure to cite doesn't happen in the future when there's a collision that involves a right or left turn across a bike lane, which, you know, the right hook is unfortunately a fairly common collision scenario.
Yeah.
So this will hopefully allow for better enforcement of those infractions and, you know, lead to a better result for the cyclist's family or the cyclist if the cyclist is injured.
Yeah, yeah, and in those situations, as a driver, it's trying to stay aware of what's happening especially on my right side. Is being a cyclist, I've become much more aware of that. So that's great that they, at least that adding the verbiage, they can enforce that better. Not great that that happened.
Sure.
So. Let's see. Can you tell, did anybody oppose this change?
Yeah, there was opposition to this change, and part of that was perhaps a bit of a confusion between this law and the Idaho stop or the stop and yield. And I don't know if that was a confusion about the two laws and that they were somehow connected to each other, or that was just we already passed one bike thing, we're not passing another bike thing right now, sort of a feeling. Some folks thought that it would be unfair to drivers to have the bike lane go through the intersection when it wasn't marked there, because they might not appreciate that it was there and sort of get stung by the fact that it was there when there wasn't paint on the road. ODOT did not come out in favor of the change. They didn't have a very good explanation for that, but they didn't support it. So those were some of the reasons why it wasn't as easy to pass as people thought it might be. A lot of folks in the bike community thought it was kind of a no-brainer kind of law,
Right.
but it did actually face some opposition in the legislature.
But it eventually passed.
It
so
did pass.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Let's see. And it's signed into law, and so it's already in effect for this particular one?
It is signed into law, but it goes into effect January 1, 2020.
Okay, so also January 1.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's move a little bit into the infrastructure elements that we have for Portland riders that they might be seeing. And we've got some photos that we should be showing here soon. And let's start with cross tracks. And I think our crew will probably put it up here soon. It's not up yet. So do you want to maybe entering into this conversation, talk a little bit about what the elements are, and then as they come up, you can share specifically about them.
Sure. Yeah. So cross tracks are one word for them is cross tracks. Another word is cross bikes. But it's basically like it's designed to look on the roadway like a crosswalk for bikes. So it's got the zebra, the zebra striping that resembles a crosswalk. And in fact, in this picture, the green portion of those lines is the cross bike, and the white portion of those lines is the crosswalk. And what it's designed to do is create awareness about the presence of bicyclists crossing at those locations, which is, I think we can all agree, more awareness is generally a good thing.
Yeah.
But where it can lead to confusion is when folks assume that it confers the same rights upon a bike rider as a crosswalk does on someone crossing in the crosswalk.
Okay.
But whereas under Oregon law, a crosswalk is a defined feature on the roadway that gives people using it the right-of-way. A cross track or a cross bike doesn't confer any additional rights and is not defined under statute. And so it's really, to get down to the basics, it's just paint on the roadway that doesn't mean anything, but that sort of highlights the presence of bikes.
So is it supposed to help the people that are pedestrians and the riders keep apart?
So the places where you often see these in Portland is where side streets that are bike and pedestrian friendly side streets, known as neighborhood greenways, cross busier streets. So the picture that they showed is of 15th and Tillamook. And 15th is a busy arterial, and Tillamook is a greenway. And and so bicyclists on Tillamook face a stop sign, and cross traffic on 15th is free flowing. And so if there were enough traffic, like during rush hour, the bicyclists could be stuck at that stop sign for quite a while, waiting for a gap in traffic to clear. And this is a high volume bike route. So in order to try and give the bicyclist a way to get the attention of the drivers, the city has put down these green stripes. And even though the bicyclist faces a stop sign and cross traffic doesn't face any control device, a lot of times what happens is that car traffic voluntarily comes to a stop, lets bicyclists ride through, even though they're not required to. And as a cyclist trying to get through town, that's actually pretty nice because it allows you to do it more efficiently. But as a lawyer who deals in rights and responsibilities on the roadway, it creates ambiguity because a driver is going out of their way to stop when they don't have to allow a bicyclist who has a stop sign to roll out ahead of them. Okay. So it creates some legal ambiguity, and my concern is what happens if it's misunderstood by a bicyclist who thinks that it gives them some rights that it doesn't, and they roll out in front of a car that's approaching. if you were to assert your right to a crosswalk by rolling into it on your bike at low speed, then cross traffic would be legally required to stop for you in a crosswalk. But if you do the same thing in a cross bike, you have no such legal protection.
Okay.
So it has the potential to cause issues, and in fact, I've seen situations where cars have come to stops for people using cross bikes and almost been rear-ended by cars who didn't expect it. So
Oh, wow.
it sort of relies on people going out of their way and volunteering the right-of-way when they're not legally required to do it, which overall is not a bad concept when it increases efficiency of moving through town, but there are situations where it could be problematic. Yeah.
Okay. How did that one come about? Like,
So in the last, I would say, 5 or so years, the city of Portland really made it a priority to install these at crossings where there's high volumes of bike traffic and no traffic signal, just a stop sign. And I think the idea is that it's a lot more cost effective for the city to put in paint on the roadway that helps the bicyclist cross than it is to put in a full-blown signal.
got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit the two-stage turn cues. So,
Yeah, the only other thing that I want to just add about
yeah.
cross bikes is just the other problem that can come up is like that the example of that photograph is at a two-way street. So you also have the problem that maybe northbound traffic would decide to stop and the cyclist proceeds, but southbound traffic elects not to. And of course, they're not required to. So there could be a collision in that situation. And the other thing is that just to kind of drill down a little bit on Chris's point that a cyclist can ride in a crosswalk. I find that a lot of people don't know that. So bicyclists can ride in crosswalks legally as long as they enter the crosswalk at a walking speed and get the same protection in a crosswalk legally that a pedestrian has. So that's kind of interesting, and it's just kind of interesting that they can ride in a cross bike and not have that protection, but if they were just 3 or 4 feet over, they would have it. So
yeah.
it is a really interesting situation, and the picture that we had up also has a nice thing that PBOT put out and attached to signposts around those areas that explain what the cross bike was all about. Unfortunately, a lot of those signs have gone down, but I believe PBOT still has that up on their website. But that's a nice explanation for people, when it was new, that was there, and it really helped educate people. This is another one of those new infrastructure things that, people don't know about, both drivers and cyclists. It's good to get the word out about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, so how about the two-stage turn cue? You want to talk a little bit
Sure.
about
It's kind of hard to say. So the two-stage turn cue, which we also have a picture of, is a device that's designed to allow for what some people might feel like is a more comfortable left turn. So if I were riding my bike through this intersection northbound in that bike lane that's marked, and I wanted to go through the intersection and turn left to go west, I could leave the bike lane and I could get into that left turn only lane, and I could make my turn and get over into the bike lane as I turn left. But for some folks, depending on their, agility, their speed of riding, and traffic conditions, feel pretty uncomfortable doing that. As we were driving to the west side today, I noticed somebody doing that, and I thought they were exceedingly brave because there were lots of lanes of traffic and plenty of traffic and pretty high speed. So what the two-stage turn cue allows you to do in that bike lane going north is, instead of doing what we just described, is to go through the intersection to the other side where that green box is in the top right-hand corner. And at that spot, you can stop, reorient your bike left, wait for the signal, and then proceed across and make your left turn.
Okay.
This is an interesting infrastructure ad because I think there are lots of people who have seen these little green boxes and really don't know what they're for at all.
Yeah.
There are some in the Lloyd Center, and not a lot of places, but I think they can be easily confused with a green box which is, a completely different, has a completely different purpose, which is goes all the way across the lanes of traffic that you can get over to at a red light.
Right.
This is very different from that. One of the nice pluses about this is that in an area like Lloyd Center, where there are also trolley tracks, it allows a rider to avoid crossing those tracks at anything other than a right angle,
Yeah.
which can be really dangerous in terms of getting your bike tire stuck in one of those. So it's an interesting, helpful device. The other place that it's really common is it's being installed in conjunction with protected bike lanes, because if you have a protected bike lane with some kind of bollard or separation, it's harder to get out of the bike lane,
Yeah.
to get into that left turn lane to make your left turn. So you find those kind of coming in paired, the protected bike lane and the two-stage turn queue.
Okay. And these are actively being installed out there, like even today, there's more of this going in.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's several in the Lloyd Center intersections, and down by the Motor Center, there's also one installed there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how about the next one is the one-way parking protected cycle tracks.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I know, across Portland, there's a big movement to turn regular bike lanes into protected bike lanes by using bollards or curbs. And another thing that is being used to protect bike lanes is a row of car parking. And I think that's appealing because it allows planners to preserve parking on a street and also have a protected bike lane, right? So we've got an example of it here. And some prominent examples of car parking protected bike lanes. There's one on Southwest 2nd Avenue in downtown Portland. There's one on Southwest Broadway over by Portland State. There's a more recent installation on North Rosa Parks.
Okay.
And it's nice in terms of knowing that while you're riding in it, you've got some physical protection from traffic approaching from behind and to the side. What I find somewhat nerve-wracking, though, when I use them personally, is that a driver turning across a parking protected bike lane has, in some ways, a bigger blind spot when they're checking their mirror and looking over their shoulder to try and locate an approaching bicyclist. So that's one issue. Another issue that I've noticed on the downtown locations in particular is that there's a lot of pedestrian traffic and folks who are going to and from their parked cars who actually don't realize that they're walking across a bike lane.
Okay.
And so that can be an issue as well. But in general, I think the movement towards more protected bike lanes is something that makes a lot of folks more comfortable riding, and that should be encouraged.
Yeah.
But sometimes the parking protected lanes can be a little nerve-wracking to use, at least for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and then we have a fourth one, the left-sided bike lanes. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the left-sided bike lanes are not as common. There's a really common set of them in Portland now on Williams and Vancouver. The Williams one is quite famous and was pretty controversial when it was put in. I think a lot of the impetus for that was that that's also a bus route, and the buses pull to the right. So if the bike lane's on the left, you avoid that bus bike back and forth. So that's a nice aspect of it. One of the obvious risks that the left-sided bike lane creates is the risk of the left hook as opposed to the right hook. Mm-hmm. And maybe drivers are not as used to seeing the bike lane there on the left, so that's something that can definitely happen with that. The other kind of interesting thing that happens in a left-sided bike lane is the sort of bike versus bike passing rules. On Williams in Portland, that famous route, there's specific instructions on the pavement that faster bikes are supposed to pass on the right as opposed to passing on the left, which, since folks are so used to passing on the right, some folks are a little bit, passing on the left, some folks get a little bit confused with, like I just did. And I couldn't really figure out the rationale for them switching that, but someone explained to me that it did make sense to them because that means that the slower traffic is closer to the curb and the faster traffic is moving around that on the right side. So then that did kind of make sense, but I have found in riding that route to and from downtown that there seems to be sort of, multiple rules being used, and so passing happens on both sides. And with, faster, modes of transportation like e-bikes coming in, it can be a little disconcerting to, get passed on one side or the other or both as you make your ride in. But that's just a good reminder that we do have the call-out rule, and it's never a bad thing to call out before you pass somebody, regardless of which side you're passing on. Yeah.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll take a quick video break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other Oregon law and insight with the two of you. So we'll just go to that break right now.
Bike safe, bike smart. Hi, my name is Xander.
And my name's Elizabeth.
Over the next few minutes, we're gonna have some fun and talk about some pretty important stuff.
Some of it you've heard before, but it never hurts to hear it again.
And again.
And again. So here we go. Did you know that just falling off your bike is enough to get a serious brain injury? So play it safe. Wear your helmet every time you ride. It can reduce the risk of head injury by up to 85%.
And that's a lot. The helmet should be snug on your head and sit flat. The strap should form a V under your ear, and the chin strap should also be snug. 2 fingers should fit in between your eyebrow and your helmet.
Also, make sure your helmet meets safety standards. Look for a sticker that says CPSC. This stands for the Consumer Product Safety Commission.
All the stuff we talked about today is common sense.
But you still need to think. Be courteous and be predictable by always riding in a straight line.
Wear a helmet. And follow the rules of the road. Ride with traffic on the right side of the road. Ride single file.
Obey traffic lights and traffic signs. Check behind you before turning. Use proper hand signals.
Stop, look left, right, then left again before entering a street. And use caution at an intersection.
Make eye contact with other drivers. Be careful around parked cars and watch for objects in your path.
And at night, be seen to be safe.
Never assume that motorists or pedestrians will see you. Remember, bikes are smaller than cars, and if there's a crash between the two, any guesses who will win?
That's all the time we have. So remember these 4 words. Bike safe, bike smart.
Oh, that was a great video. Very informative. I like it, the use of kids too in that. So we're back with Cynthia Newton and Chris Thomas about some newer Oregon cycling laws and newer or newish infrastructure design to improve safety for vulnerable users of the road. So let's delve a little bit into injury and crash situations that are in the spotlight and best practices to avoid or mitigate their effect. So do you want to share a little bit about, we've got a few on here, car doors, collisions with other cyclists, and do you want to share a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. We wanted to bring a couple maybe less commonly understood or maybe less known. I mentioned the right hook and the left hook. Those things are pretty commonly understood among cyclists, but car doors, and this, I'm just speaking from my recent experience, just becoming hyper aware of how incredibly dangerous it can be for a cyclist to collide with a car door. Maybe part of that is these larger cars, heavier doors with SUVs. Maybe part of it is that these collisions are happening more frequently. Why is that? Well, I think, just anecdotally, that it might have something to do with more people are having more things delivered to their homes, by Amazon or other Grubhub kind of, smaller individual, cars. They don't look like delivery cars necessarily. They just look like a person, but they're sitting there, and then suddenly the door flies open.
Yeah.
We have the same issue a lot with Uber and Lyft drivers, letting people out. So I just feel like there are more car doors opening unexpectedly than there ever were before. The other circumstance that happens in is with protected bike lanes, because now, in addition to the driver door, you have the passenger door that can open into that bike lane. So the kinds of injuries that we see in those kind of cases are upper extremity injuries like bilateral arm fractures, and then the other really big one is head injuries. And I thought the kids, put it really well when they talked about wearing helmets and how much that helps reduce head injuries, and how much of a problem it is to have a concussion or a traumatic brain injury from a bicycle collision, which will, can have either mild or pretty significant consequences that take quite a long time to recover from. So I just really want to increase people's awareness about car doors. In terms of best practices for riding, some of the bike lanes are snug up against the car door swing area.
Yeah.
So, taking the left side of that bike lane, even though it may not be that attractive to the cyclist coming up behind you, can be one way to give yourself a little bit more time as that door swings open. The other thing too is just being more aware of it. I think we used to think of this more as happening in commercial areas and downtown in bike lanes, but where I've seen the most serious injuries is just casual rides in the neighborhood, just not appreciating the fact that a parked car, that the door could just fly open, and that's maybe when people's are most relaxed and have their guard down. And seen some really serious injuries in those situations.
Yeah, so it's good to build that awareness. Man, a lot of good stuff's coming up. Had you, with like Uber and these food delivery, have you seen a bit of a significant increase in that sort of injury, or has it?
Yeah, I mean, we've got some recent examples of folks who have been hit by both of those types, food delivery and Uber or Lyft.
Okay.
So, a lot of times, people who are driving for Lyft and Uber are going to a place they're not familiar with, or it's a crowded place like a sports event or something, and they don't always use the designated parking areas, and their customers can be kind of in a hurry sometimes. So it can be the kind of thing where when I'm riding, seeing a Lyft or an Uber sticker on a car is like a warning sign as I'm approaching from behind,
Oh, that's
right?
good. Yeah.
And there's all kinds of cues like that cyclists get accustomed to picking up on, that a car's doors might fling open at any moment. But one sort of redeeming factor is that Oregon law is pretty clear that the car door opener has an obligation to check before opening the door that the coast is clear. But of course, the best practice is to try and avoid it in the first place.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about e-bikes. So why don't you start with the legal definition of an e-bike?
All right. Well, this is a statutory definition, and it's in ORS 801-258. An e-bike is defined as something that is designed to be operated on the ground on wheels, has a seat, has not more than 3 wheels, has fully operative pedals for human propulsion, and also has an electric motor. And the key to that electric motor is that it has to have a power output of not more than 1,000 watts, and it is incapable of propelling the vehicle at a speed of greater than 20 miles per hour. So that's an e-bike. An e-bike is a bike under Oregon law, and it's also a vehicle, as is a regular bike.
Oh, it is. So if you had to make a distinction between a motor vehicle, a bicycle, and what's the other one here? In a vehicle,
Right.
you know, how is that going to impact riders out there just to be able to make all those distinctions?
Right.
Right.
So Chris is going to talk more about this, but first we can start with a bicycle is a vehicle,
Okay.
but not a motor vehicle.
Right.
An e-bike is a vehicle, and even though it seems like it might be a motor vehicle because it has a motor, there's a specific statute that says an e-bike is a bicycle and a vehicle, but not a motor vehicle.
Okay.
Okay? So from there,
Right.
Chris is going to talk about why that matters.
Right. So if you look at sort of the vehicle code generally, there are a number of statutes that bikes are bound to comply with. But the statutes don't specifically call out bicycles, right? It says vehicles must do this and that. What makes bicycles subject to those laws is a statute called ORS 814-400 that says bicycles will be treated as vehicles under the law, unless an exception applies. And the exceptions are when it would just be impractical to apply that law to a bicycle. For example, like DEQ emissions testing. You can't apply that to a bike, so it doesn't apply. There's a statute that says also that e-bikes are considered bicycles. So unless there's something in the statute that specifically says otherwise. So for the most part, if you read a bicycle statute, it's going to apply to e-bikes the same way. And when there's a different application with respect to e-bikes, it's usually called out specifically in the statute. So, for example, if you look at the riding on the sidewalk statute, there's something in there that says bicycles can generally ride on sidewalks, but not if you're an e-bike.
Okay.
So it's specifically exempted. And there are a few other instances of that. But for the most part, e-bikes are treated as regular bikes.
Okay. Now, if you're somebody that has just picked up an e-bike and you want to be more clear about where some of those distinctions might be, where would they go to?
Right. So that's a good opportunity to plug our recent law firm production, which is an e-bike legal guide.
Okay.
You can find that and some other resources on OregonBikeLaw.com,
Okay.
which is our firm bike law resource page. But one interesting example of how bikes and e-bikes are treated differently that I see in the Portland area is that e-bikes are not allowed in Portland city parks. And so, and Portland city parks have kind of a broad definition that includes the waterfront park, the East Side Esplanade, and the Springwater Corridor, which are pretty desirable e-bike destinations for a lot of people.
For sure.
But if you look at the Portland City Code, you're actually not supposed to ride your e-bike in those places. And that's a sort of a holdover from language in the city code that says motor vehicles aren't allowed in those places. And so e-bikes kind of get lumped in with other motorized devices rather than given the same freedoms that bicycles have. So
if you are out there on an e-bike and somebody that understands that that's part of it, specifically a law enforcement agent, they could stop you and tell you to leave, I assume?
Right, yeah, and that's a pretty low priority, I think, for law enforcement.
Yeah.
But where we would be more concerned about it is if a collision happened between an e-bike rider and another user.
Okay.
The fact that the e-bike rider was there in the first place and wasn't supposed to be could be used against them in the liability determination.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks. That's good to know that. So a growing group of cyclists, so women maybe haven't been out there as much, and maybe because of safety concerns, they don't join readily for some of the road bike riding. How do you see laws and infrastructure improving the perception of safety for vulnerable riders? Do you feel like it's improving?
I do. I think that the protected bike lanes, I think, are really helpful. I also think that there's been some really great work done by women in the community to promote cycling among women. One of them is Ride Like a Girl,
That's right.
Carol and Jen's organization, you may be familiar with. And one of the things I know from being around the culture of some of these women riding groups is, you know, this is a stereotype, but it does tend to have some truth to it, that a lot of women have not really been able to figure out how and when and where to ride, because a lot of times if they are with a male partner, that person likes to go out and ride fast and far. And that's maybe not as enjoyable for them, either because they haven't been riding as long and they're not up to that kind of fitness, or they're just not interested in, you know, that kind of a rigorous ride, and they want to maybe be more social or have it be a little more relaxed. And again, these are stereotypes, but it is what I've seen in some of the riding groups. And so I think with Ride Like a Girl, the Street Trust has a women biking group as well, and there are other rides like that on Meetup. I think that creates the kind of community. I think it's more desirable to ride maybe in numbers than all by yourself. So those kinds of things, I think, are making it more attractive for women to get into riding. And I know there are also some great groups in town, like Bike Farm, that's got some non-binary and trans kind of opportunities for people to get out and work on bikes together and ride together. And I think that the more people we can bring into the riding community, the better. And it's been really nice to see those developments in the past 10 years or so.
That's really good.
Yeah.
We've actually come to the end of our time, and that's a great place to end it too, actually.
Yeah.
I really appreciate both of you coming on the show. It's been very informational.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
So thanks again to you and our viewers and our guests, Cynthia Newton and Chris Thomas, local attorneys. Knowing the law is one way to practice safe cycling. I hope you are familiar with your legal obligations. Ride safely, legally, and it will still be fun. Northwest Bicycle Safety Council promotes safe riding, both by obeying the laws and by riding with a level of skill. If you want to ride a bike and see some sites, join Ann actually on one of our many rides listed at portlandbicyclesclub.com. And she also leads some shorter rides to help you find your place in the cycling world. By riding with others, you can increase your skill, learn new routes, learn to ride in groups, learn about other rides and events, and make new friends. And so please investigate. And that's it.